I was just getting used to the quiet. After a decade of combat logistics, the silence of my Chicago workshop was a luxury, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the antique clocks I was restoring. Each one was a small victory, a broken thing made whole again. But then, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I hadn't seen in 15 years, a ghost from a life I'd carefully put away. The name on the screen made my blood run cold. Frank Miller, not my dad, just Frank, the man who had walked out on my sister and me when we were kids. I took a breath and answered, but the shocking thing wasn't his voice. It was the unshakable certainty that he wasn't calling to reconnect. He was calling to finish what he started. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. I am Maggie, and I was just getting used to the quiet. For 10 years, I'd been a cog in a massive military machine, living by the rhythm of orders, formations, and the thunderous roar of cargo planes. After that, the silence of my Chicago workshop was a luxury, a profound peace that settled over me each day, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the antique clocks I was restoring. Each one was a small victory, a broken thing made whole again, a way of building something real with my own hands. I would spend hours with a jeweler's loupe pressed to my eye, studying the intricate dance of gears and springs, feeling the fine grit of dust and age under my fingertips as I meticulously cleaned and reassembled. I found a certain comfort in the precision, the predictable order of a clock's inner workings, something my own life had never offered me. It was a tangible way to make amends with my own past, to take something damaged and give it a new chance at purpose. My sister Chloe often told me it was my way of fixing what our father had broken in us. She was probably right. My phone, a device I had trained myself to use only for what was necessary, buzzed with an incoming call from a number I hadn't seen in 15 years, a ghost from a life I'd carefully put away. I saw the numbers, a long string from an area code I knew, but hadn't thought about in over a decade. The name on the screen made my blood run cold. Frank Miller. Not my dad, just Frank. The man who had walked out on my sister and me when we were in high school, leaving us to fend for ourselves with nothing but a stack of bills and a locked front door. He wasn't the kind of man who left a forwarding address or a goodbye note. He simply vanished, leaving a gaping void where a father should have been. I took a breath and answered, my voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in my stomach. But the shocking thing wasn't his voice. It was the unshakable certainty that he wasn't calling to reconnect. He was calling to finish what he started. His voice was smooth, too warm, the kind that could sell you a broken car and make you thank him for the deal. He said he was in town, that he'd been thinking about me, and that he wanted to have dinner. Just the two of us. To reconnect and make up for lost time, he said. I've changed, Maggie. You'd be proud of the man I am now. The words felt like a cheap coat of paint over a crumbling foundation, a disguise for something I knew was still rotten underneath. The memory of the last time he'd resurfaced came flooding back, a gut punch of betrayal. It was years ago, after our mother passed, and he'd come back with the same smooth talk. He'd found Chloe, who was just starting out as a nurse, and begged her for money, claiming he needed to start a new business to finally provide for his girls. Chloe, with her gentle heart and desperate hope for a family, had given him her entire life savings. And a year later, he was gone again, leaving her with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills, a mountain of debt, and a shattered dream. I knew he wanted something. Frank Miller always wanted something. He was a master con artist, but his greatest con was always himself, a man who believed he was a victim of circumstance, not of his own bad decisions. The thought of him circling back now, after so long, made my blood run cold. Chloe was finally on her feet. She was working 2 jobs, a night shift at the hospital and a part-time gig at a clinic, saving up every last dollar to buy a small house. Her one dream, my gut, the same one that had kept me alive in combat, told me this wasn't about me. It was about protecting her. My goal wasn't to reconnect. My goal was to confront him, to find out what he was planning and stop it before he could ruin her life again. I would go to this dinner, not as a daughter seeking closure, but as a silent protector, a shield between my family and the man who kept trying to break it further. I told him I'd think about it, and hung up, my hands trembling slightly as I stared at the low light in my apartment, the urge to block his number and retreat into my safe. Quiet world was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't. Not this time. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed a familiar number. A private investigator, a former military colleague named David Chen, who I trusted with my life. I had a different kind of mission now, and I needed to gather intel before I walked into the enemy's camp. He listened to my request, his voice calm and professional on the other end, and told me he'd get back to me. He said he was going to run a basic background check, a precaution. A couple hours later, I agreed to meet Frank at a new, ridiculously expensive restaurant downtown. The kind of place he would choose to project an image he hadn't earned. The day of the dinner, my phone rang again. It was Frank. His voice, usually so smooth, was thick with feigned panic. "Maggie, you won't believe this," he said, his voice shaky. "I was just on the phone with Chloe. She's been in an accident, minor, but she needs emergency surgery to fix a broken wrist. I'm rushing over there now, but the hospital needs a down payment. They won't take my card. Said there's some kind of hold on it." My heart dropped. A cold, sickening lurch. He was using Chloe, using my love for my sister against me. The lie was so specific, so calculated. It almost worked. He told me he had a solution and could explain everything at dinner. If I would just bring a small certified check to help them. This added a new layer of urgency. A cruel twist. He wasn't just trying to get me to show up. He was trying to get me to come with my defenses down, bringing money in hand. I hung up, and my first instinct was to call Chloe. She answered on the first ring, her voice perfectly normal, a little tired after a long shift, but no hint of injury. I asked her about the hospital and a broken wrist. She laughed. "What, no? Maggie, I'm fine. Just got home." "Why?" My blood ran cold, and the nausea from my father's lies flooded my senses. My relief was a bitter taste in my mouth, quickly replaced by a furious resolve. I knew now that this was not just a scam, it was a trap. I immediately called David Chen back and relayed the new information. He listened intently, his tone shifting from professional to gravely serious. He told me he had found a link between Frank and Veronica to an ongoing investigation into a series of financial scams targeting family members. He told me to stay calm, to not mention his call, and that he would have a team on standby near the restaurant. I wasn't just going to dinner anymore. I was going to a sting operation. I arrived early, my nerves a tight knot in my stomach, and chose a table in the corner, with my back to the wall. A habit from my years of training, I watched the door, my eyes scanning the faces of every person who entered. My military training had taught me to observe, to notice the small details that others missed, and I felt that familiar alertness sharpen within me. Frank walked in a few minutes later, looking older, his hair a little grayer at the temples, but with the same charming, predatory smile. He spotted me and waved, the grand gesture of a man who loved to be seen. He stood to hug me, his grip too tight, a facade of a father who missed his daughter. He gestured to the woman next to him, a younger woman with an air of calculated grace, whose smile didn't reach her eyes. Her expensive dress and perfectly coiffed hair looked a little too polished, a little too perfect. He introduced her as Veronica, his wife, a name I had never heard before, a woman who seemed to have stepped out of a magazine and into our contrived reunion. The shocking moment was when I saw Veronica subtly slide a small leather-bound folder onto the table next to my father's bread plate, a gesture meant to be hidden from me, but not from my trained eye, a clear sign that this wasn't a family dinner, but a planned business transaction. The dinner was a masterclass in manipulation, a game of cat and mouse disguised as a family reunion. They didn't ask about my well-being or my life in general. Instead, They asked about my military pension, my savings, my work as a restorer, probing for weaknesses, for an opening to insert their scheme. I answered every question with a vague, noncommittal response, turning the conversation back on them, watching them squirm under the weight of their own lies. They told me about their new life and their business ventures, the words as hollow as their smiles, as the main course arrived. Veronica, with her overly polite, syrupy smile, reached over and topped off my glass of water without being asked. A gesture that was meant to be kind, but that instantly sent a jolt of ice through my veins. The shocking moment was when I caught the faint, chemical aftertaste of something strange in the water. A detail so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. This was the ambush. It wasn't just a con, it was an active threat. I immediately understood this wasn't just a con. It was an ambush. I had to get out of there, and fast. I leaned back in my chair, my posture straight and composed, my expression unchanging, as my mind raced through every possible scenario, my military training taking over. I had to get out of there, and fast. But I couldn't do it in a way that would spook them. I needed to wait for the right moment. Frank, oblivious, launched into his final pitch, a convoluted plan for a new beginning for our family, a request for me to invest my pension into a real estate deal he and Veronica were working on. He said, "This is it, Maggie, the chance to make it all right, a chance for us to finally be a family again, all of us." His words were a sickening echo of the empty promises he had made to Chloe years ago. The shocking moment was the anonymous text message that buzzed on my phone, making my hand jump. "Check Frank's credit report. Run. Don't walk." It was from an unknown number, but I recognized the phrase "run, don't walk" as something my old drill sergeant used to say. It was a warning, a desperate one. I excused myself to the restroom, pretending to be ill, my mind racing at combat speed. I immediately ran a check on Frank Miller on my phone, and the results came back almost instantly, not just a bad credit score, but a series of major fraud and grand larceny charges. The shocking moment was when I saw the final line on the report. Subject is a fugitive from justice. The restaurant, the woman, the fancy folder, it all made sense. They weren't after my pension. They were using it as bait, a financial lifeline for an even bigger scheme. My father was a criminal running from the law, and he had planned to use me to escape. My body went cold, my heart a hammer against my ribs. The nausea I felt wasn't from the water. It was from the realization that this man, my father, was a monster. I knew what I had to do. I walked back to the table, my face a mask of calm, my posture straight and composed. I didn't sit down. I looked at Frank, then at Veronica, and said, "I got the message. The game's over." Frank's charming smile instantly melted away, replaced by a mask of panic, his eyes darting toward the exits. Veronica tried to regain control, her composure cracking. But I cut her off. The shocking moment was when I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing 911 right in front of them. My voice was low but clear as I spoke into the receiver. "I'd like to report a fugitive for fraud and grand larceny," I said, my gaze fixed on Frank. "His name is Frank Miller, and he's at this address." I gave them the restaurant's address. Frank stood up and grabbed my arm, yelling, "What are you doing? I'm your father." He sounded desperate, unhinged. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with cold, unforgiving eyes and said, "No, you're not. You're a criminal, and you're going to jail." He dropped my arm like it was on fire. The tension in the room snapped as I spoke to the dispatcher, my voice calm and precise. Frank, in a desperate rage, grabbed my arm, but I stood my ground, my posture as solid as a statue. He was a small man, physically, and my military training had taught me to handle much larger, more violent individuals. He wasn't a threat to me. Not anymore. The shocking moment was when I looked him in the eye, my voice as cold as ice, and said, "I am not your daughter. I am a witness, and you're a criminal." He dropped my arm like it was on fire, the words stinging him more than any physical blow ever could. The wail of sirens outside grew louder, and I watched as the officers entered the restaurant, their eyes scanning for my signal. I simply pointed at Frank and Veronica. a silent gesture that spoke louder than any words. Frank and Veronica were arrested right there in the restaurant, and though the other diners looked on, confused, I didn't care. I'd faced worse. As the officers escorted Frank and Veronica out of the restaurant in handcuffs, a man with a quiet demeanor and a serious face approached me. He introduced himself as Detective David Chen. He was the one who had sent me the text message. He explained that he had been investigating Frank's fraud ring for months and had been tracking him. When he saw that Frank had a dinner reservation with me, he feared the worst and sent the warning. The shocking moment was when he showed me the contents of the leather folder, a forged power of attorney, with my sister Chloe's forged signature on it. They weren't just after my pension. They were using me to get to my sister, their ultimate target, a way to legally seize all her assets. I had saved her without even knowing it. The realization made me feel both sick and relieved. I had saved her. The arrest was only the beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, interviews, and paperwork. David Chen explained that while the arrest was a major victory, a powerful and expensive lawyer had been hired by Frank's associates. They were already working to get the charges dropped, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and that Frank was a victim of a targeted smear campaign. I was needed as the key witness, my testimony crucial to keeping them behind bars. My life, which had just begun to settle into a peaceful routine, was once again turned upside down. I had to recount every detail of the dinner, the phone calls, and my history with Frank. I spent hours with David Chen and the prosecutor, preparing for a court case that threatened to drag my family's dirty laundry into the public eye. My sister, Chloe, was a mess. She was terrified of testifying, of having her past trauma aired out for everyone to see. I promised her she wouldn't have to, that I would handle everything. This new challenge was more than just a fight against a con artist. It was a fight for justice, for my sister's peace, and for my own. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, a chilling new threat emerged one evening. As I was locking up my workshop, a sleek black car pulled up. Out of the passenger side stepped Veronica, her face contorted in a mask of cold fury, her bail allowing her to roam freely. "You think you won?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over? We have friends. Maggie, powerful friends. You and your sister are going to regret this. Drop the charges, or we will make your life a living hell." It was a direct threat. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a psychological war. I stood my ground, my hands clenching into fists, my military training kicking in. I didn't say a word, just stared her down with a blank, unreadable expression. She got back in the car, her face a mask of defeat as I stood there, unbroken. The next day, I had my workshop's security system upgraded, and I taught Chloe self-defense. I knew that my fight was no longer confined to a courtroom. It was a fight for our safety, for our lives. The trial was long and arduous. I sat on the witness stand, recounting the events of that night in minute detail, my voice steady, my testimony unwavering. Frank and Veronica's lawyer tried to discredit me, painting me as a bitter, vengeful daughter, a liar with a history of family drama. But I held my ground, my every word backed by the evidence David Chen had meticulously collected. On the last day of the trial, I locked eyes with Frank across the courtroom. He wasn't the charming, smooth-talking con artist anymore. He was a small, broken man, his face pale and his eyes filled with a desperate fear. The jury's verdict came back swiftly guilty on all counts. A wave of relief washed over me, a peace I hadn't felt in years. Justice had been served. I reached for my phone and sent her a text, a simple message that finally put our past to rest. "He's gone, we're safe now." She called me back, her voice filled with tears, but also relief. "He called me this morning asking for money," she said. I hung up the phone and walked out of the courtroom. A free woman. I didn't want a new beginning with the man who had only ever brought me pain. I had already built my own beginning, and it was a masterpiece. I knew that the silence I had cherished was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the quiet of a life finally at peace, a life I had built on my own terms, with my own hands. I walked into the night, knowing I was finally free. The city lights seemed brighter, the air cooler, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking towards my future. The ticking of the clocks in my workshop no longer felt like a reminder of broken time, but a celebration of the precise, beautiful order I had fought so hard to create.